Hey guys, welcome to another movie review. Today I'm talking about a film that really isn't getting a lot of attention right now, but there's two performances in it that I think are getting just enough buzz where it might show up at the Oscars, it might not. But I think the subject matter that this film focuses on is very relevant. It's still going on today. The Me Too movement is very active to this day, and that is for the film She Said. And in She Said, basically what this film is about is it's the two journalists that exposed Harvey Weinstein for all the really terrible things he was doing behind closed doors, all the terrible things that he specifically asked women to do behind closed doors when he was on movie production sets and having quote unquote business meetings with them. And so basically, what these two women wanted to do is first they wanted to try to expose Donald Trump, but since he won presidency, that didn't work out, and he had too much power at that time for them to kind of expose him to the press for something like that. But then there was a story of someone else getting exposed for it. And keep in mind, the Me Too movement was very much not alive at this point. It was very much a very quiet thing. It was just one of those things where maybe you heard from somebody that something terrible happened to them, and then you just kind of feel sorry for them, and then settlement happened, and then it just kind of ended. Um, but that is not what happened with a lot of these women here. So basically, over the course of this film, they try to interview people who were victims of Harvey Weinstein's actions, and they're trying to basically make sure that these people of high power, specifically in Hollywood, do not have the right to basically perform these really terrible things on people. And so over the course of this film, they're trying to interview as many people as they can, specifically victims of Harvey Weinstein, specifically people who worked for him as well, not necessarily just women, but people who are defending him in court and are a part of his payroll system in Hollywood and stuff like that. So over the course of this film, Zoe Kazan and Carey Mulligan, and I unfortunately don't remember the two journalists' names. One of them had kind of a weird last name to pronounce. I'm not even going to bother trying to bring it up on camera just because I don't know if I'll be able to give it justice. But Zoe Kazan and Carey Mulligan play the two journalists that are based on two real people. They both worked for the New York Times. Both these women had families, and so there was a lot of things that they had to sacrifice in order for this story to come to fruition within the press. And we get to see how that story happened and all the terrible things that these women had to keep secret for years until the story got public. And I personally remember when the story first kind of got big. There was even a picture. I think it was the day of that the story went big and went public. There was a picture of like Harvey Weinstein crying in his garden or something like that. But like it's just the small things like that you remember when a big story like that comes out. And so it's just one of those films where I really wanted to experience it because I do personally remember when this story kind of blew up and more women were coming forward and the story got bigger as more women came forward with this. And so thankfully this film gives that story justice. So let's talk about some positives and negatives of She Said. But before I go into that first, though, you guys, I will say this film is overall very well done. There's a lot of things that this film does where it either could go, so disturbing where you kind of experience the stuff that these women experienced in the moment along with them, or they could, express the disturbing stuff in a more tasteful manner. And there's things that happen in this movie where they show or talk about something that would be very hard to talk about or depict on screen, and they do it in a very tasteful manner. But it's like I said, let's go over some positives and negatives of why I like the film and some things I think the film could have improved upon, and why we may or may not see it at the Oscars, but we'll have to see how that all plays out. So, but for my positives and negatives of She Said, Zoe Kazan and Carey Mulligan, the two journalists in the movie, I love how serious they were. I liked how likable these two women were. And there's even times where these journalists were just kind of cute around each other. There's a scene where they're both wearing the same outfit as they're going door to door to talk to some of these women, and one of them makes the joke that we're just kind of these journalist twins that look really cute, and you would hope that they would answer the door just based on how cute our dresses are together and stuff like that. So there's some fun little moments like that that give the film some levity. But for the most part, these two journalists are very serious. Both characters always have a phone around them on almost every scene they're in this movie. They get woken up in the middle of the night. One of them was taking care of her kids and had just like 3 or 4 phone calls within the same hour. And so when the story got serious, clearly their family lives were impacted by all of this. And like I said, for the most part, they're very likable people. They're not unlikable. They're not these disgruntled journalists that are trying to get, expose men for what they are and stuff like that. They're really trying to get this story out there. They're really trying to show just how awful it was that Harvey Weinstein was getting away with all this stuff. That men like Harvey Weinstein, even with that much power, shouldn't be able to get away with the terrible stuff that they did. And so I think the film does a very tasteful job of exploring all those things. And for the most part, the film has a very strong depiction of journalism. It really does show kind of what the classic journalist looking to investigate a big story has to do to get a story out there. They have to get all their sources. They have to get all the right people to interview. They have to get people to quote. They have to get people to. They have to get permission to basically mention their name and to mention their quote within the article and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that goes into journalism that some people might not realize. And so I think the film does a great job of depicting just how much work it is and how there's even times where their boss says this just isn't enough material to publish this within the New York Times. We need stuff that's legitimate, stuff that is a direct source, stuff that is, clearly connecting the dots of all the stuff that this person is doing. So I like how strong the depiction of journalism is in this film and just how much work goes into it and how you kind of have to pour your life and soul into this job in order for it to work successfully. The film also visually shows the settings of some of the victims of some of their stories, and I think that's very effective. There's something I'm going to get into in my negatives, obviously, but one of the things I think the film does very well is it visually shows you the hotel that some of the Harvey Weinstein stuff happened in. It visually shows you the before and after of some of the effects that Harvey Weinstein had on some of these women, how they really kind of had everything going for them when they first worked for Miramax, and how when all the stuff went down, how awful they felt and how disconnected they felt and how they just didn't want to talk to anybody, whether it was friends, family, or boyfriends or girlfriends. They just could not talk to anybody after all this horrible stuff went down and how nobody was believing them. And so, like I said, there's something in my negatives I'm going to come back to regarding this point. But for the most part, when the film visually shows you the place or visually depicts, like for example, rather than showing Harvey Weinstein in the shower, then asking women to do these terrible things to him, or him asking them to do the terrible things to him back and stuff like that. It visually shows like the water running in the shower. It doesn't show about anybody in the shower, but it gives you the point that it was a very creepy walk and a very unsettling walk to this bathroom for some of these women and all the stuff that, like I said, Harvey Weinstein asked them to do and stuff like that. So the film visually shows the setting. It gives you kind of the impression of what the women were feeling. There's even, I think, a shot of like clothes on the ground, so you kind of get the impression of where it might be going and stuff like that. It doesn't directly show you what happened. They definitely explain the stories in full detail without actually showing some of it. But I like the idea that they visually show the setting and get the impression of just how unsettling the situation was within that setting. The film also does depict the destruction of these events on its victims, of just how there's one woman that getting this job at Miramax was just kind of her dream job, and how Harvey Weinstein kind of just settled over it with money, and how this terrible thing was committed, and how she's just kind of in this random neighborhood in this random state now, and just not being able to live her life, not being able to talk to people that she met in Hollywood. And it just kind of shows the destruction of just how sad they were, and how when these journalists are trying to get the story out of some of these people, they just shut down and don't want to talk about it and say, oh, I settled it in court, and oh, I can't talk about it, and oh, I don't want my husband to think I'm this terrible person. And so there's just all this stuff that really shows just how destructive and how long-term the damage is of just all the stuff that Harvey Weinstein was doing to these poor women. And so the film depicts that. It's very disturbing at times, but I think the film needed to do that in order to show just how destructive this behavior was on all these women that were impacted by this. And for my negatives of this movie, I only have a couple of them, but one thing I think the film could have improved upon was, like I said, one of these points is related to one of my positives as well, but some of the interview elements I thought were a little repetitive. It's just one of those films where if you're not really super intrigued by two people just sitting down and talking to each other for a long time, there's a lot of that in this movie. There's not a lot of, Zoe Kazan and Carey Mulligan running around. They go to a lot of different locations. They definitely have to track down a lot of people to get this story into the press. But there is a lot of repetitive elements of just two people sitting down, one person saying how horrible Harvey Weinstein was and how horrible it was to that Miramax wouldn't defend them and stuff like that. And so some of the interview elements are just a little repetitive to me. I've actually seen some other reviews mentioning the same thing, and I totally get where they're coming from. Some of the interview elements is a little repetitive in this movie, and I think that's something that the film creatively could have expressed a little differently or could have found a different way of depicting some of these interviews. Also, going back, like I said, to one of my positives, though I liked that they showed visually the settings of some of these stories that took place, the film doesn't always have the most interesting narrative to tell things, unfortunately. Like, it'll probably use that setting thing I was telling you about earlier, maybe 2 times. It might show you the before and after effect of another victim at another point, but it really doesn't. There's just a lot of times where it's just two people sitting down, one person expressing what they're discussed, the other person listening to them, one of these two journalists. And that's really all the film does for about 2 hours. It really is just kind of simplified. So I don't know if they just didn't imaginatively approach this in the most unique way. There's just a lot of times where I just feel like the product isn't the equal of the sum of its parts. There's just a lot of times where, like I said, the narrative just isn't as interesting as it probably could have been. So that's one aspect of the film where something I liked, but something I needed to see more of. And so I bring it up on my negatives because some of the times they don't have the most interesting way of expressing that narrative for the story. And unfortunately, this film isn't the most rewatchable film out there. Um, yeah, it might get either like an honorable mention from me, or if it makes my top 10, it's going to probably be the very bottom of it somewhere. It's not a very rewatchable movie just because of how disturbing some of the stuff is, and just like I said, how it's just two people sitting down, one person expressing their disgust, another person listening to them. So unfortunately, it's not the most rewatchable film in the whole world, but it's still a very good film. So overall, I'm going to give She Said an 8.5 out of 10. A very well-made film, a lot of great things about it. It definitely shows just how much work goes into journalism and just how much these two women had to work in order to get these group of women, this large group of women, to be able to share their story of all this terrible stuff Harvey Weinstein did to them. But like I said, it is a little repetitive at times. It doesn't always have the most interesting narrative, and it's not the most rewatchable film in the whole world, but 8.5 out of 10 for me. I do recommend seeing She Said. I think it's an interesting part of history. I think it's an important part of history. And I think it's a film that most people should see just to be able to see just how destructive these events were on some of these people and how it really was a big story that was kind of the story of a generation when they first published it. So 8.5 out of 10 for me. I do recommend She Said.